colonial systems, such as indentureship, established ways to regulate not only people's bodies in the way that our ancestors were shipped from India to come to Guyana to work on sugarcane fields, but also to control their feelings and desires and psychological states. And when we think of where in the world, as you said, historically, being queer has been made illegal, it tends to be because of colonization. And colonization is kind of like the really big thing that that makes cultures that would have otherwise been accepting, unfortunately, less accepting.
This is the Moorish podcast, where Caribbean history meets culture and cuisine. Hi, it's Hema, host of the Moorish podcast. We've come to the end of season 3, and I will be taking a short break as I prepare for season 4. Looking back at the season, I've had some incredible guests sharing their work and research on Caribbean history, culture, and cuisine, and I am so grateful that they've taken the time to join me for an episode. I also want to thank everyone who has listened. I appreciate you so much. I get messages from listeners telling me that they've learned something new or expressing appreciation that our Caribbean history and stories are being told the true history and not the one that was thrust upon us by those who colonized the region. Those messages and comments mean so much to me, so thank you for sharing. I have lots of fun and interesting guests lined up for season 4, which will begin in the fall. Stay tuned, and in the meantime, head over to YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok to stay connected. Enjoy this episode, and I will see you in the fall. Shaharah, thank you so much for joining me today on the Moorish podcast.
Thank you very much. This is such a pleasure, and thank you for reaching out and asking me to be part of it.
This is going to be an interesting conversation that has to do with culture in the Caribbean diaspora. And I had a conversation with Ryan, who is the founder of the Indo-Caribbean Canadian Association, earlier this year.
That's awesome.
And
I love Ryan.
Ryan was a fantastic guest, and he was talking about one of the events that the Indo-Caribbean Canadian Association puts on around Pride.
Mm-hmm.
And in that conversation, we got to talking about what it's like being queer in the Caribbean community and some of the feedback that he has gotten. And I really wanted to explore that topic a little bit more, which is why you're here with me today.
Thank you for being willing to talk about it, because like kind of as we were saying before, it can be a very taboo topic, and it's something that needs to be talked about in our community and in the Indo-Caribbean community especially. So thank you for giving light and giving us visibility on your podcast.
Before we dive right into this conversation, can you introduce yourself?
I certainly can. Yep. My name is Shaharah Gaznabbi. I use they, them pronouns. I am based in Toronto, but also in Mississauga, and both my parents are Guyanese, but I am a first-generation Indo-Caribbean person. I'm an overall theater creator, playwright, director, dramaturg, and also a drag performer as well. So the Indo-Caribbean Pride party that we host during Pride, it's called Watless. I'm hosting this year, but last year I was a performer. So performer last year, hosting this year, and it's like the best time in the world. So, and also I'm the chair of the EPIC committee for the Indo-Caribbean Association that Ryan is the overall chair of, which is cool.
And Ryan is very fond of acronyms. Remind me what EPIC stands for.
EPIC stands for Equity and Pride for Indo-Caribbeans. So it's basically our queer branch of the organization. But all of the acronyms of the organization are fabulous. There's Voice, which is for like voter rights, and there's Spice for single parents. So yeah, it's a really, really lovely organization. I'm very proud to be a part of it.
Before we move further into this conversation, I want to talk about language, because language, terminology, It's so important. And we know that in the Caribbean, there are songs that use some derogatory language that have become just a part of everyday vernacular because people hear it in a song. There's different terminology that people use that sometimes they don't even recognize that it may be hurtful or harmful. So I used the word queer when we
Hmm.
first started this podcast, and I would love for you to share your thoughts and feelings on some of the language, how we should be speaking about the community, and what is respectful and maybe what is not so much respectful.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, queer is a term that has been reclaimed by the queer community. So I specifically use queer, and I find it to be a really nice umbrella term to refer to anybody who kind of is outside of the heterosexual or cisgendered kind of norm. I also think it's a kind of nice term to use if you don't know really where you sit or if you're questioning within that community. So there's actually a lot of flexibility around the term. Of course, way back when the term queer used to mean weird or funny, but it has since been reclaimed. So the fact that you used it is actually totally, totally fine. In terms of the like 2S LGBTQ plus community, it stands for two spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and plus. And plus can mean anything from asexuality to polyamory to anything in that spectrum of both sexuality and gender. And the queer community itself has ordered like LGBTQ based on who we feel needs the most like visibility and representation first. So after the AIDS epidemic, lesbians became the beginning of LGBTQ because lesbians would visit gay men in hospitals and would basically be there for them in their last moments. And right now we have 2S LGBTQ, two spirit, because I think we don't talk about two spirit identity enough and indigenous queer people and living within those intersections as well. So those are those two. And you also sent me a term that I had never specifically heard either, which is Queeribbean. And I think that I want to start I want to start using that one for myself. Like I'm a Queeribbean person, kind of like how I speak Franglais, which is a bit French and a little bit English. Yeah.
It is not a term that I came up with, certainly. I was in a webinar
Hmm.
recently. They used the term Queeribbean, or Queeribbean. I don't know how you want to say it. I think either is fine. It's just like if we say Caribbean or Caribbean.
Yeah.
But I've also seen, since I heard it in this webinar, I've seen it around, once you see something, you start to notice it. And I've seen it around in several different places on Instagram. It's not a term. It's a term that I heard from somebody from the community, and I thought, okay, so that's probably okay to use.
Yeah, and I think that it's epic, and I want to start using it as well.
So this is an interesting conversation because for a very long time, being queer in the Caribbean, so if you were living there, in many places, if not all countries, was illegal. And then attitudes started to shift. But then if you're living abroad in the diaspora like you and I are, there still is a little bit of, I'm unsure. I don't know if it's okay to come out. But I think that stems from the attitudes of people living in the Caribbean. So I want to go all the way back to, do you know why attitudes and why it was illegal to be
Yeah,
queer?
I actually like I don't think I know the be all question, but I do have answers for you. How much do you know specifically?
Honestly, I don't know a lot. I was trying to do a little bit of research on it,
Hmm.
and truthfully, it's hard to find
Yeah,
some some historical information because, and I think it's hard to find because people don't want to talk about it.
yeah. People don't want to talk about it. It's information that people have actively tried to erase, and it's also history that people are okay with forgetting. And I've been able to find really great queer scholars who are writing about this. Prayati R. Kumar is one of them, and I don't know exactly their pronouns, but they wrote a book called An Ordinary Landscape of Violence, which speaks especially from a lesbian Indo-Caribbean historical perspective and talks about something called affective violence, which is when colonial systems, such as indentureship, established ways to regulate not only people's bodies and the way that our ancestors were shipped from India to come to Guyana to work on sugarcane fields, but also to control their feelings and desires and psychological states. So that's what Prayati calls affective violence or affective colonization. And when we think of where in the world, as you said, historically, being queer has been made illegal, it tends to be because of colonization. And colonization is kind of like the really big thing that that makes cultures that would have otherwise been accepting, unfortunately, less accepting. Like in Hindu cultures, there are gods that are transgender and that shift gender and morph, and the colonial structures just like made it really, really limited. Colonial powers always tried to maintain control over intimate and emotional lives of indentured people. And especially as they were trying to bring in women and forcing women into indentureship, that's something that they wanted to regulate. And it's easier to control women of good character than, women who, especially the way that women were viewed back during the times of indentureship, having control over women allowed people to categorize quote unquote acceptable behavior or to belittle sexuality in that way as well, especially when they were already scapegoating indentured women, especially as they were calling them untrustworthy and fickle. And that's why we don't have a lot of history about it, because from a lesbian perspective, those are the stories that they wanted to diminish and already called untrustworthy and fickle and all of those things. So effective violence and effective colonization is how they controlled. That's why I feel like being a lesbian and being a queer person in general as an Indo-Caribbean is immediately decolonizing. And my way of like, and like whether you're out or whether you're not out, that's absolutely fine because just existing is decolonizing. But I'm first generation Canadian, and there are people who still feel the pressures that they had in Guyana, but in Canada, because colonialism is intergenerational. And there are parts of colonialism that the effects of it continue to be felt no matter where you are and no matter where in the timeline you are, because it takes time to decenter those and to break those apart. It's harm that's still felt, especially with like religious institution in Guyana and in the Indo-Caribbean, like Trinidad as well. Um, because the way that religion was taught and imposed for our ancestors allowed them to normalize a culture of shaming and regulating sexuality and gender identity. And that especially is still felt. And a lot of people who are afraid of coming out are afraid of religious parents or religious grandparents who still have those mentalities that are from those times. It's less of our ancestors to blame, but the colonial powers, which sucks.
So much of our history and so much of behaviors and attitudes. I talk about food and culture on this podcast, but overarching culture community in the Caribbean stems from colonization. We have this
Absolutely.
racial disparity that was taught to us to ensure that the Afro-Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean communities couldn't band together and rise up to overthrow
Absolutely.
the
I am
colonizers.
the biggest proponent of that. Like when people are like, why do the like Afro Caribbean people and Indo Caribbean people just like despise each other? It's because that's imposed on them. So it's less, so I feel like that's why in my generation we have to break that apart. And it starts with people like you and I, like if we're like first generation to break that. break that generational curse in a way.
Yeah. And it starts with understanding why it happens, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people that don't understand why they feel
Hmm.
this way, why their attitudes are this way. They're just following what was brought down in their families.
Yeah.
And they couldn't be able to pinpoint this attitude. They just know it exists and it's something they were taught. And the more we talk about the history and the more we reclaim ourselves, the better chance we have of not dividing, but becoming one community, accepting of
Mhm.
all.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's very, very well worded.
Do you know if there's anywhere in the Caribbean that being queer is still illegal?
I do believe that it's still that, and I feel like it's still illegal in Guyana. Let me do a search.
There's a difference in being illegal and being frowned upon, and I think there's places where it is no longer illegal but still frowned upon in certain circles and certain communities, and that's still some barriers that we need to be able to get past. But when it comes to the legality, that's a much bigger concern, problem, challenge.
Yeah. Okay, that's perfectly well worded. From my very, very quick study, I've found that right now the legal status of LGBTQ rights in Guyana is that for male same-sex partners, it is illegal, but for female, it is legal, which I found really interesting. Also, that Guyana is the only country in South America that being queer is or being gay is illegal, which is very, very interesting, especially as we're the only English speaking country and the only country that's still kind of considered part of the Caribbean. So that's from my quick Google search. But I think that what you said specifically about being frowned upon is kind of the biggest thing, because there are people in Guyana who are afraid of being visibly or openly queer because they're afraid of harm, really. And I had like an artist in Toronto. Her mom went to Guyana, and her mom heard like stories about people saying, I am afraid of using dating apps because I'm afraid it's going to be a setup and that I might be harmed and in that way. And she kind of asked us the question because I was on a panel, a queer, specifically queer Guyanese artist panel. She asked us the question of like, what are you guys going to do to help people in Guyana who are afraid to come out or afraid of being themselves? And I've kind of that was when I was 20 years old, and I'm 23 now, so I've had like 3 years to think about what my responsibility as like both an artist but also as a person who is openly queer in this community to do. And like I thank you for giving me the space to talk about it on your podcast because I feel like that's like one small way that I can.
I'm wondering if, just based on what you were just talking about, and I'm using some terms that may not apply to everybody, but do you think it's more difficult for men versus women? Based on
It's
what you're saying, that in Guyana, it's illegal for men to be gay, but not for women.
and I wonder like and my question is like why is that? Because I know a lot of the time even like older British colonial states like people would over sexualize lesbians or commodify lesbians, and that tends to be the reason why. I don't imagine that it's easy for anyone. Um, and when it's just for women it's legal, but for men it's not. I would question why that is, especially when in the Caribbean there is such like almost like a machismo expectation for men, and men have to be the providers and have to be strong and have to be the alpha male. And I can imagine that anything that is less than that, like any crack into potential femininity is is going to be a place of vulnerability, especially because, as I said before, people scapegoated women and made them untrustworthy and fickle things and had to be of good character. So if a man is anything proximal to that, I feel like that would be very difficult.
It's also much more acceptable for women to show affection to each other
Mhm.
in
Yeah,
any situation, regardless of their sexuality, their relationship to each other. Whereas
yeah,
it's not necessarily where men in the Caribbean and in the diaspora showing affection to each other is not the norm.
absolutely. That's so true because I can hold my girlfriend's hand in like the TTC, and I'm sure people are like, they're just really good friends. Like that's totally good. But yeah, when you see two men holding hands, it is less. Yeah, completely less the norm, which is unfortunate, isn't it? Like I love when men show affection to each other. Yeah,
Yeah, there's regardless of relationship, if you're friends, if you're relatives, or if you're in a partner situation, affection and being vulnerable is part of the human experience.
absolutely. Yeah, and I like a lot of Indo-Caribbean fathers that I know are stoic and are and this is like goes far beyond just being queer, but being a man in the Caribbean and being vulnerable and not being that stoic like brown dad guy. It's a bigger conversation about masculinity in general.
It is so much a bigger conversation about masculinity in general. And it also is this grand conversation about, certainly in my family and in a lot of families that I see, not a lot of overt affection and
Yeah,
emotional connection in families. We tend to keep things pretty surface.
yeah, we do. And even since coming out to my parents, like I feel like I've connected with them way more than they ever did when I was a child. And like they're amazing, amazing, amazing parents. But I found that like being queer was a good in to being open with my parents, but I don't know, I just had a normalization of there are certain emotions that I'm not going to be open about with my family and things I'm going to hide from them, unfortunately. You're right. There's such a culture of of holding back,
Yeah.
which is yeah,
It's almost this facade of being connected and being joyful, but once you start to look at it, it doesn't go very deep.
yeah. Because and like there are so many beautiful parts of being Indo-Caribbean. Like we wind up upon each other and we lime and everything, but then when you really look into like the interpersonal um relationships like this, they're so heavily influenced by this masculinity and religious institution and things like that. And that's the really interesting nuance about our community that I find really interesting.
Are you okay sharing your coming out journey?
Yeah, I totally am. Um, being queer was something that I kind of always knew in a way, but I only really had words for it when I was in middle school. And I was like, "Oh yeah, this like as like learning terms made me feel like okay, what I am feeling there's something that I could put a name to it. Um, like knowing that I could be gender fluid because I always felt like a tomboy, but also kind of femme, but also kind of not. That that felt really that felt to sit really well in my body, and it wasn't like just knowing those words made me that way. It actually just allowed me to really understand what I was already feeling. But I was closeted about all of my queerness and all of my gender stuff until I was like 19 years old. So, like my first year of university, when I started doing stand up. And I never invited my parents to my stand up ever because I talked about being queer in my stand up. But people like knew that I was doing stand up and that I was doing comedy and that I was writing plays about things. And my family was like, "So what are you writing your plays about? Like what is and my sister knew I was queer and I came out to her first out of everyone else in my family when I was 12, like when I was in middle school. And she kept it with me. Like for I could always just have her as somebody who knew, which is very sweet. But um yeah, so my I showed my sister my stand-up archival video and then she showed my brother and I'm like, "Oh my god, so I guess my brother knows now." Ah, and then but they were like, oh, this is actually really funny. And then my mom was like, why are you showing everyone but me? And that was the day where I was like, okay, so I'm going to tell you. So I was literally doing a show called Gay AF, so it's hard to hide. I have a big sign beside me that says Gay AF comedy. So that's that. Is that okay? And she was like, mm-hmm. And I just felt like it was the biggest thing to be that vulnerable with my mom. And my mom never made me feel like I couldn't be myself, but was always really afraid. And I think that a lot of my anxiety comes from the anxiety that my mother had as I was being raised, which makes complete sense when you're coming from an immigrant population. And when you're like, she moved in the 80s and was called a packy and yelled at from people driving in vans and things like that anxiety of coming has kind of been imposed on me in ways. And it's been part of my journey, especially as an artist, especially as an artist, to kind of break that apart a little bit, because I talk a lot about being queer and then also being Muslim as well. And that's something that my mom, um, something that she always told me not to do. Like, she was like, you can talk about being queer on stage, great, amazing, lovely, do that. You can talk about being Muslim too if you want. Just know that not everyone's going to be happy with the way that you talk about being Muslim. And also, your way of being Muslim isn't everyone's way of being Muslim. But then talking about being queer and Muslim together, don't do that, because you can be putting yourself in danger. So then I did it, and like I feel bad that she feels that way, and like and then a lot of that anxiety does kind of live in me, but also that's kind of why I feel like I need to do it. I got a grant from the Toronto Arts Council last year to do a queer Muslim space, and then we got like like non gender non-specific writers who were queer and Muslim to come into a space and be together. And like, they are the most lovely people in the world, and they want to tell their stories, and they have such rich stories, and it's really, really important that we give those stories visibility. And if I'm afraid to talk about it, then if I was afraid to talk about it and I never created that space, I would have never made such beautiful connections with people who also feel the same way that I do.
I mean, it sounds like your mom was pretty easy to accept once you shared that side of your life with her.
Yeah.
What about your extended family?
You know what? My family's a really interesting one. It's so interesting to be surprised by my family and by my extended family. I lived in London for 2 months, and I stayed with some extended family there. And the aunt that I stayed with said something really interesting, which is, in belief, our community tends to have issues with queerness, but in practice they don't. Which can be true and not, depending on who your family is. But I know people who might say like, oh yeah, I don't get it. I don't understand how you can like the same gender. But then in practice, people will still feed you pepper pot at Christmas, and people will still like accept you guys. And I found like that's very luckily, very, very luckily been my experience. I also am not the only queer cousin, which is really interesting. I have like 1, 2, 3 other queer folks in my family, and then myself. And luckily, they kind of broke the seal in a way of having their partners around before I ever brought my girlfriend to the fam. And it was, my mom will always say, okay, maybe you just like introduce her as your friend, just be friends for this. But then I'm like, oh, this is my girlfriend, and they're like, oh, hi, and they hug her and accept her. I'm always pleasantly surprised. I've never had anything really bad, and I think it's helpful for people to just see the love in Indo-Caribbean people, and that's what my partner always says, is that Indo-Caribbean people are always so welcoming, no matter who you are. And so accepting Indo-Caribbean people and Guyanese people and Trinidadian people exist. There's a lot of fear around it, but they do exist. And I'm very lucky that my family is one of those.
What you just talked about is so interesting to me. And I'm thinking about my own family and my own cousin's coming out journey is there is this nobody treated her any differently. She was still invited everywhere, accepted everywhere, loved as much as she had always been. But there was still this like pss, 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 pss behind her back when she wasn't around. And it wasn't even negative talk. It was just, did you know? And she has a girlfriend. And it almost felt a little bit, looking back on it, feels a little bit juvenile in those conversations. It's like gossip, but not
Yeah.
malicious gossip. And it's as strange as you were talking about in belief versus in practice.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, as we know, like our aunties love to gossip. And I think that they like to know little tidbits of their life. And in a way, it's kind of like a love language. Like aunties, in my experience, want to be like kind of just want to be in the know. And like I think being left in the dark is something that tends to affect them more. But I don't even. It's a weird thing. Like gossip is also a thing that patriarchally they've frowned upon because women are going to talk about us. So then I put it. Whereas personally, I kind of love when people talk about me, but only if it's good. I mean, look, at least it's good. I don't know. I always joke that all of the repressed homosexuality from our older generation steeped into the younger generation, and that's why we have so many younger queer people in our family. So yeah, I don't know.
This conversation that I had with Ryan, he was telling me that one of the attendees of the Pride party said to him, I feel like coming here to this party allows me to be my full Caribbean self and my full queer self in one space where normally I have to be one or the other.
Oh, that's really sweet.
And I feel like this is the kind of sentiment that I'm wondering if you have any insights to share from some of the people that you may have encountered, spoken to through your work with the Indo-Caribbean Association and EPIC.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, like Ryan talks about third spaces a lot, which are places that like aren't your home and aren't your work, but a third space so you can go to relax and to have fun or to meet people and socialize. And that's kind of a lot of what EPIC, like the Equity Pride for Indo-Caribbeans does, is to create those safe third spaces exactly because of testimonies like that, where people don't have to compromise being queer or being Indo-Caribbean in the space, that you can absolutely, absolutely be both. And that like I can do drag to Sundar Popo and things like that can exist. We like Epic did a coming out day panel and talked to people who were pretty openly out in our community and got questions from parents and people who were coming out of what that experience is like. And I think seeing, because our community is so it's not talked about as much, it's really good to hear different perspectives, people whose parents maybe weren't very accepting and had to kind of find a chosen family of their own, or people very, very luckily, like my family, who are very accepting and knowing that those two things can exist within the same community. And I think having different examples of that is really important. And also met a lot of queer Muslim people through the Indo-Caribbean Association as well. And we had our first iftar event. And a lot of our organizers and people who came like were open and talking to me about being queer, and like even when their parents were at the event they were like, also me too, um without their parents knowing. And it felt very safe to know that that was a safe space for them, or that our like Ryan, my presence can be a safe space for them in that space. So hopefully that answers your question enough, and sorry if any of these answers are circular in any way.
No, there's no, this is the answer, this is right, this is wrong in this conversation. There's
Good.
so many nuances. And because of the historical context, because we're all humans and we have feelings and emotions, we all react differently to something that is not what we expected, right? And
Absolutely.
And so maybe you have a friend or a family member, somebody in your community who is coming out and it's unexpected to you. The reactions can vary and can differ, but hopefully through conversations like these, we can help people understand that there are ways that you can be supportive, and you have to understand, you don't have to, you should understand that
Yeah,
somebody's journey doesn't make them any less of the person that you loved 2 days ago.
absolutely. Yeah. If anything, it will invite even more of themselves. Like if you already love this person, accepting them is just going to make them more of themselves and you'll love them even more because of that.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
this idea of creating of these third spaces, right? And these safe spaces to me is fantastic. And I love that this is an option for so many people. Somehow, some way through this work and through conversations, I would love for this not to be a fraught conversation, but just to say, okay, so and so is queer, and that's fine. Just like in our community, this woman is not getting married and not having children, which can also be frowned upon, is also fine, right? And I feel like there's these little things that we just need to accept about each other, because at the end of the day, it doesn't affect me if somebody decides not to get married or if somebody is queer. We need to not let it affect us in this big, grandiose way.
Absolutely. We're okay to break from the traditional. We're allowed to break from that like colonial standard of you get married, you have kids, you have a husband, but like it's and I think that our community becomes more vibrant and more beautiful when we're allowed to be different, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's even more so, I think, in Canada, which is where you and I are, where you and I live,
Mhm.
because as you were alluding to with being Muslim and being queer, when your mom was being called names, we have other things that are going against us, right? Just
Yeah.
our names, our skin color, that some people don't find accepting. So do you think that that makes it harder as a queer Indo-Caribbean to come out to the wider world, or is it not an issue?
It's a good question. I mean, there's always like there's a beautiful like obviously the term in intersectionality, which is one of my favorite terms where the more intersections of identities you have, the more I find that the more nuanced your experience as a human is. It of course makes it harder, but also you can speak to more things and you can connect to more people. Like I'm very grateful that I can connect to people from a disability standpoint and from a POC standpoint and from a Muslim standpoint. And it honestly makes my life way richer, way, way, way richer than if I was a straight white man who was not disabled, who was not this. It's like I feel like I would find that existence quite boring, unfortunately. So I think that I live a rich existence because of that.
I think it's indicative of younger generations, first generation Canadian, Indo-Caribbean, making strides. We're moving, we're changing behaviors. We're not just accepting the colonial mindset that has been thrust upon us through the
Mhm.
generations. And my hope is that future generations will continue this work so that when we talk about the history and the colonial mindset, it is a thing of the past.
Absolutely. We're not striving for that. We're not like that's not the thing to strive for anymore. And we're allowed to kind of rewrite what we want our lives to look like. And it doesn't need to fit that standard. And so I'm glad that that's your hope because it's my hope as well. And I know that it's hard to think about, but it's also really freeing to just know that I'm allowed to be like myself and I don't need to be like the Bill Gates white guy sort of thing. Yeah, sorry Bill Gates, but yeah, kind of thing.
Now, we are talking, this entire conversation, I think, would be very different if you and I were sitting in Guyana or Trinidad, and that's where we lived and that's where we grew up.
Totally.
The experience there is probably a different experience than certainly being in Canada. And I do just want to acknowledge that we are speaking through the lens of living and growing up here in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many beautiful, vivacious people that were born in Trinidad and Guyana and who moved here, and it is a balance between those two things. But no matter where you're coming from, like your identity matters. And even there's a drag queen that I adore, and she's like a close friend of mine, and her name is Guy Annabella. And she says that the Caribbean people and queer people are exactly the same in very many ways. Like we're both loud, we both love to party, things like that. Our community is so inherently quote unquote queer in a way, whether we like it or not. But of course, there's such a privilege of being in Canada. But also, if you do live in the Caribbean, know that we see you and know that you are accepted and you are allowed to be yourself in our eyes, which is an important thing.
It is an important thing, and maybe it's not as open as it is here, but things are changing.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about your work with the Indo-Caribbean Canadian Association, being
Mhm.
the chair of EPIC, because this is such a important initiative. You've already talked about third spaces and you've talked about the Pride events, but tell me about that whole section of the organization.
Yeah, it's honestly, I mean, there are so many important branches. Like we have Star by Star Gyal, which are for our youth programs, and our Indo-Caribbean youth, which is so important. And I find that those branches and then Epic are like, for me, the ones that I think are the most important. But like everyone has the ones that they feel are most important. This is my total bias. Um, we do a lot for our community and just finding spaces to have fun. We do have we really want to organize a queer mental health workshop, which is a bit more of a serious tone, but also allows people to talk with ideally like a South Asian psychotherapist. We want to have spaces like that where people can also get support in the epic community, but also I think a lot of what we do is people being able to come have fun and be vivacious together in a way.
So it's June and we're
Yeah.
we're going into all of the Pride events and Pride season, as some people might call it, here in Toronto. And just around the corner is one of your big events.
Absolutely. We have Watless coming up. So Watless is Epic's biggest Pride fete and event that we host. It's going to be at the supermarket this year, which is actually a bar and not just like Loblaws or something. And we have Guy and Bella Sangina performing as well as myself. And we're still trying to organize a band to come in as well. So it's gonna be a lot of fun. And there's also like a lot of other organizations and not only just Indo-Caribbean, but like Brown in general Pride events that are happening. For example, I'm performing in Brownout as well, which is a specifically brown stage at during Pride weekend. And there are people who are of Pakistani descent and Tamil, and I'm Guyanese. So if you're interested in just like brown art and brown drag and burlesque things like that, that's also something you should definitely check out as well.
I don't know what the ticket situation is going to be like, but I'll leave the links down below if anybody's interested in finding out more. It might already be sold out, and if it is, I'm so sorry.
Thanks.
Let's talk about what else you are working on because you shared your bio with me and you have quite a career. There's a lot of things in the entertainment space that you work in.
Appreciate you asking, and like I appreciate you saying that. Well, because I'm a theater creator, I'm always that sounds so narcissistic. I'm always in something, which is but I'm very lucky to be busy in the way that like I'm performing. There's actually by the time this releases, this will probably be over. But I'm doing a a play commissioned by a UK playwright about Guyanese sisters who are in kind of a law situation, which is really really exciting. So I'm going to be doing a workshop with Why Not Theater for that. But I'm also directing a Toronto Fringe show right now. I tour a show called Jungle Book, where it's a full South Asian cast, and we tour to America and around Ontario, and we're going to be touring again in 2027, which is really really exciting. So there's a lot of really exciting things. The best place to really see what I'm up to is on Instagram, and it's my drag name, which is my handle, which is Huck King Hilarious, and yeah, I love doing everything under the sun and sharing that with people. So yeah,
I'll make sure also to leave a link to your Instagram in the show notes so people can find you.
I appreciate that.
Before we wrap up, we've talked about a lot of different aspects of being queer in the Caribbean, Indo-Caribbean diaspora, and a little bit of history. If you could, to anybody listening to this, whether they are considering what their sexuality is, what their gender identity is, whether they know and they're heterosexual or if they're out, anybody listening to this, do you have any final thoughts on helping them and helping us move forward in this conversation?
Oh, that's a really, really beautiful question. I think that the thing that I would say to anyone is that we see you and that no matter how you feel, all of it is valid. There are I like to live in the space where there's no binary, where you don't have to be completely sure that you're either straight or gay. You can live in a space where you you might find different people like a certain way, or maybe you don't find that at all. And anything that you might be feeling is especially valid. I think that the world is a lot more flexible than we like to think that it is, and I'm really glad that it is. And there are people in our community that see you and that you are not alone. There are so many beautiful Indo-Caribbean queer people and transgender people and drag performers and artists and people who will like accept you and gobble you up right away. And it's really, really beautiful. We have such a beautiful community, and there are people and even elders in our community that will accept you and do accept you already without even meeting you. You know, we already see you and love you. So that's what I would say.
Shahara, thank you so much for joining me today on the Moorish podcast and sharing not only your personal experiences, but some words of wisdom and just helping us understand and see this part of our community as a part of the whole community, as opposed to a separate section. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks. I really appreciate it, Hema. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for today's episode of the Moorish podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. It really does help in getting the podcast in front of more people. Follow on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube for videos and more. And I'll see you for the next episode.